Hi, I'm Menaka Raman-Wilms, and you're listening to the Decibel from the Globe and Mail.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition. Stop. Go Falcon, go Dragon. Godspeed, Axiom 1.
How much would you pay to go to space? For Canadian businessman Mark Pathy, it was $50 million US. He was one of three extremely wealthy individuals who took a trip up to the International Space Station for what was slated to be a 10-day stay this month. He bought the ticket from a private spaceflight company called Axiom Space.
And after all that training and anticipation and the multiple delays, to finally be in that seat and to feel the engines ignite and that thrust start to push us up off the launch pad, a few minutes later, only to reach space, that was unbelievable, really exhilarating.
That's Mark talking to the Globe's science reporter, Ivan Semeniuk, while floating around in the space station.
Sort of getting oriented in the space station, we came in through the zenith hatch coming from the ceiling, so it was a bit disorienting coming in, and that was really a fantastic moment to have finally arrived. It was actually pretty emotional. I think, wow, we finally made it, and it was great to be here, and then to be around, floating around in zero gravity or microgravity is quite an experience.
By the time you hear this episode, Mark should be back on Earth, assuming that the weather conditions work out. And his trip might represent the start of a new chapter in space tourism, one that goes beyond rich people joyriding in space for a weightless selfie.
If space is going to become, especially human spaceflight, is going to play a larger, more important role in our future, it clearly needs to be accessible to a broader range of people.
Ivan's here to talk about the future of private space travel. That's today on the Decibel. Ivan, thanks so much for joining us again.
My pleasure.
So you actually interviewed Mark while he's on the International Space Station, the ISS. How did that actually work?
It's not the first time I've interviewed someone on the station, but it's the first time I've interviewed someone who was not working through a national space program, say through NASA or the Canadian Space Agency. What was interesting chatting with someone like Mark Pathy is, he's been training for a few months, but the whole center of his life has not been going to space, and certainly he has not done it in the media spotlight like a representative of a national space agency. So it was sort of an ordinary conversation, which I found kind of refreshing.
I'm just curious about the logistics of it. Was it like a Zoom call? You guys on video talking to each other?
I could see him, he could not see me, and that's the norm for speaking with astronauts on the space station. So they basically come into frame, and he was floating around. He was sort of keeping himself upright, but I asked him to give everyone a wave so I could do a screen grab, and he tried it in a few different orientations, which was fun at the end.
What did you hear from Mark about why he wanted to do this? Why did he decide to pay and go up to the ISS?
He, of course, like many people, was sort of a space fan and a science fiction fan. He talked a lot about growing up on Star Trek and so on, and sort of dreaming of that idea, but never imagined that would be something that he would experience. He didn't think of himself as a person who talked a lot about going to space, but probably he does, because when Axiom Space, this private company, first advertised itself as looking for crew members for the first private mission, a friend of his sent him the ad, a company he says he'd never heard of before, and he had to take a serious look at it, and after some long consideration decided, is this something I want to do for real, or is it just a fantasy that's going to stay a fantasy?
I also wonder, because astronauts have to go through a lot of training, did he have to do similar kinds of training before he actually went up there?
His training really began in earnest last fall, and that's where he sort of, he runs an investment company. He's got his own business. He's got a family life. He's had about 1,000 hours of training in all the various aspects of, launch and being on station, all of the things, but certainly enough to know what he's doing at this point and also to conduct the science. And he's had to fit that around a fairly hectic schedule to keep the rest of his life going.
Have there been other Canadian space tourists to arrive at the ISS before Mark?
Yes, one other. People will remember Guy Laliberté, who is one of the founders of Cirque du Soleil.
So we're preparing that show, and I think at the end, the coverage we had so far for the event has been very, very good. For the awareness of the situation of water in the world, I think we're exactly where we want to be at this time. So we'll see later.
The focus for him was raising awareness for water issues on Earth. And it did. He famously wore a clown nose in space, and kind of got some media attention that way. But this is a little bit different because it's meant to be not just sort of an individual finding a way up, but something that will become a regular feature.
Last year, we actually saw a bunch of billionaires have very flashy kind of blasts off into space. They were actually just on the edge of outer space. But anyways, now that we have Mark Pathy, a Canadian, who paid a lot of money to go to the International Space Station, what sets Mark's trip apart from those of other wealthy individuals and celebrities?
Right. So, and I think what's interesting about the timing of this is he first announced his intention to go to the space station back in January of 2021. So it's been more than a year ago. And in that time, sort of the landscape, or at least the media landscape for wealthy entrepreneurs going to space has really changed because two high-profile billionaires, so Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos, both with their own space companies, did suborbital space flights. We've also seen William Shatner go up and others. These, and I just want to stress, these are suborbital flights. So they're launched in these vehicles of different kinds, but they go up. They don't actually orbit the Earth. They go up and they go down, but they sort of cross that threshold, the 50-mile threshold, which is, by some measures defined as the boundary of space.
That's 50 miles up, like out of Earth. Is that the idea?
50 miles altitude, right? If you think about it, it's not that far. You could easily drive that distance in no time, but space is not far away. This is a completely different proposition. The company Axiom bills itself as the first private space station. They haven't got there yet, but they say that they're on the path to having a fully private, fully commercial space station of their own. But as a starting point, they are basically the organizers or the coordinators of commercial missions to bring paying customers to the International Space Station. There are meant to be more missions of this kind and eventually modules added to the space station. And perhaps, the longer range plan is to have those basically separate off and have a completely independent, commercially funded space station.
And you mentioned that he's doing some work up there while he's up there. Can you tell us about that?
I think there is a bit of eye rolling that goes along with very wealthy individuals going to space because we've seen so much of it in the last year. And it's clear that Mark Pathy and, in fact, all of the people involved in this Axiom flight are clearly trying to distance themselves from that sort of joyride idea. All of them are involved in a fairly dense suite of science experiments that they've taken with them or that they're engaged with. Mark Pathy has got 16 experiments working with several Canadian universities, also with the Montreal Children's Hospital.
And now, as the Globe science reporter, Ivan, are there any of these experiments and things that he's doing up there that really stand out to you as exciting things?
Some of them are cool, and there is a cool factor there. I'm always a little bit skeptical of the cool factor, but I have to say one of the ones that certainly has already gotten some attention is this first demonstration of two-way holoportation. So what happens is, someone in space wears this special headset called a HoloLens. And basically the headset allows you to see your surroundings, everything that's around you. But in addition to that, there's a person in another location who kind of materializes Star Wars-like in front of you in 3 dimensions, and you can communicate with them, and that person is on the ground.
That sounds very cool, actually.
That sounds very cool. He's demonstrated that technology a few times and interacted with people on the ground. And the practical application, and they tested this out, was to do sort of a mock consultation with a physician. But also, I think that he's able to do some experiments that maybe would be sensitive for professional astronauts. And I thought one thing that was interesting, he's working with the Montreal Children's Hospital on this one, some experiments to study pain in space. And as the researchers in Montreal told me, this is not an easy thing to talk to astronauts about. If you've been training for years and years to get on a mission, the last thing you want to talk about is experiencing pain while you're in space. Their remark was that they found very little in the published literature on this, and we're hoping, and so they're doing a bunch of experiments to try to explore this with Mark Pathy, and they're also Earth observing experiments too. So he's getting a lot of opportunities to look down at the ground from space and do photography, and that's clearly having an impact.
How does this private spaceflight company, Axiom Space, how do they make sure that these trips are safe for regular people?
Well, I mean, there is a certain degree of risk that's, you can't completely eliminate. Mark Pathy spoke to me about that as well. He clearly expressed confidence that in the technology. The space station, of course, has been now in orbit for more than 2 decades, and now we've seen people ferried up to the space station in the SpaceX Dragon capsule. This is the company, Elon Musk's company, but also other companies are involved in bringing cargo to the station. So this is now becoming the norm. I think we're going to see it become the norm as well, or at least a kind of private-public partnership when exploration moves further to the moon and elsewhere. So it seems like a trend that is going to become a permanent feature of how space goes forward. And so this is clearly a milestone. I mean, we've gone from the space shuttle and other capsules, built by national programs, bringing people to the station, to now SpaceX. Other companies are involved in bringing supplies and astronauts. And, this idea that, in fact, there could be a fully private space venture seems like the next step in that direction. Pathy told me at one point when I interviewed him before he flew that, if space, especially human space flight, is going to play a larger, more important role in our future, it clearly needs to be accessible to a broader range of people. Now, granted, right now that means people who are very wealthy. But you can easily also imagine not just a single individual who's self-financed, but you can imagine consortia of research institutes or tech companies or venture capitalists or others who might have reason to access low Earth orbit. And, that keyhole where you apply to have an experiment through a national space agency, that's very limited. And so, this creates new pathways for people to try things in space that maybe would not have been possible before.
And what do government-run space programs then get out of an increase in private spaceflight?
There is a little bit of revenue because Axiom is paying for access to some extent. I think really what it does, it's allowing a broader range of interests and channeling private resources into space in an area that has been well established or well mapped out by national space agencies, which in theory would then allow them to focus on more distant areas of human space exploration. So, NASA wants to go back to the moon. Canada has also signed on to this. Of course, we know people are eager to go to Mars, or at least some people are eager to see a person on Mars, and, kind of more pushing the envelope that way to more deep space flight. There is a certain element of low Earth orbit that is becoming routine. And, in a sense, what we're seeing is a shift where maybe, a government-run space agency doesn't have to do everything to make low Earth orbit possible for humans.
I guess the thing that we always kind of have a bit of a concern about, though, with private companies taking over a space is that it's an unregulated space then. So with these increased kind of public-private partnerships that are happening with space travel, are there government regulations that are coming into play to make sure that it doesn't just become about the corporate interests?
I think that's a really great question, and I don't think there's a single clear answer to that yet. Clearly, at the moment, you have some astronauts coming to the space station. This is a very constrained situation with where cooperation with the agencies and the nations that are partners on the space station is explicit, and of course, once the private presence is such that maybe they have their own station or stations or lots of others are launching, that may change things, because you also kind of wonder, what's the jurisdiction in space? It's a little bit like the high seas in a way, maybe even more so. I think the constraint on that is there are only so many people that are going to into space. But there are international organizations that are trying to, lay out policies and to determine agreements that will help foster the peaceful use of space. And in a way, it just adds an additional player or an additional factor in those efforts where you're already trying to get different countries, often with very different governing systems. You think about China and the United States, for example, or other players in space, to get these countries to cooperate in how space is utilized. The private sector then brings an additional wrinkle to the table, but that's how that's going to be worked out.
Yeah. I want to talk about one of the criticisms that we heard a lot about after Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson went into space last year. Many people were bringing up the fact that rocket launches results in a lot of greenhouse gas emissions there. And, at a time when we're really trying to reduce that, are these flights necessary given the environmental cost? And is there an argument for it, I guess?
That's another good question, but I'm not sure how you weigh that because lots of science has a large carbon footprint. Obviously, going to space is very energy intense. On the other hand, the number of people who go to space is just a handful, in the big scheme of things, especially compared to all the launches, commercial and public, of hardware into orbit. And we're at a point now where it would be very difficult to imagine living without the products of space, including GPS.
So when you say hardware, that's like satellites, essentially?
Exactly. Satellites mainly. Yeah. And things that are put up in orbit to serve us in different ways, including climate monitoring. So there's much more of that going up than there are people going up. I haven't done the math in terms of what the total carbon footprint is, and I'm not sure how you would balance that against what the scientific value is. I think, like many things, it's really not a quantitative question, but there's a value judgment there. And I think that debate is going to continue, but I don't think it's going to deter people from wanting to go to space. I think there's a certain personality profile, whether they're adventurous or whether they just have a feeling that the long game for humanity somehow involves investment in space. It's a deep conviction that this is important. And I think people either have it or they don't. And, I'm kind of on the fence about it. I find it fascinating to see how people articulate the value of space or not. And I think that's a conversation that's going to continue.
Do you know if you would go to space given the opportunity, Ivan?
I think it's very unlikely that my family would go for it. But since but I don't know, maybe. But since I haven't been presented with the option, I don't know what I would say. I don't know what I would do. Oddly, I think if it were part of my work, that would make it easier. But whether I would do it just for personal things, I have to say I'm not sure.
Ivan, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
That's it for today. I'm Menaka Raman-Wilms. Our intern is Emily McPhail. Our producers are Madeline White and Cheryl Sutherland. David Crosby edits the show. Kasia Mihailovich is our senior producer, and Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.